Okay, today we're going to talk about Chapter 31, Lesson 4, The First President Bush. If you are not familiar, there are two President Bushes, so it does get a little confusing. So the first President Bush, George H.W. Bush, ends up winning the 1988 election. He was Reagan's vice president, if you recall, and he beat the Democrat Michael Dukakis. So I have their pictures there. He beat him quite handily, right? 426 to 112 in the Electoral College. So what is it like during his presidency? Well, the Cold War is ending. So things are changing in the Soviet Union. Remember Soviet leader Gorbachev, he wanted to end the arms race because he's trying to reform his country and he needs to spend his time and money and efforts on that. So he is more open to making agreements with the United States. So one of them is the Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty, or START. They like their acronyms, right? And both sides, the Soviets and the United States, agreed to destroy all their existing nuclear weapons. So that's huge, right? To have these two big powers agreeing to do this. So definitely better for peace. All right, so what's happening? Well, in all of Europe and the Soviet Union, right, communism is, people are getting more open with their unhappiness with communism. And so you start to see, right, some changes. Gorbachev he was okay with making some economic changes. Remember, we talked about glasnost and things before, right? Well, this is also spreading to the rest of Eastern Europe. In Poland, a good example, 1890, when for the first time they're able to have labor unions. This was for shipyard workers. And the labor union they formed was called Solidarity. And the leader of that union was a man named Lech Walesa. And he is the pictured there on the left. And he became a strong vocal leader and symbol of communist resistance, okay? So they hold force. The Solidarity, the labor union, had a lot of sway and a lot of power, and they get the first open elections in Poland. So there are definitely, the democratic feel, or at least get rid of the communism, right? So you start to see throughout Europe major demonstrations and a weakening of Soviet control and many communist governments starting to collapse. So for example, do you remember in Germany how Eastern Germany was controlled by the Soviets, right? It was communist, and how they had put up the Berlin Wall, right, to keep all the East Germans in, remember? Well, they start opening that up and letting people go through, and then people kind of overtake and start like tearing down the wall. Okay, so you can see in the picture there, that's one. There's many pictures of people, even though the wall's open, they don't need to do that, right? It's symbolic, right? And so people start taking a chunk of the wall for posterity. And today there's sections of the wall in a lot of famous places and museums and things like that. And when you go to Washington, D.C., one of the museums we go visit has a big chunk of the wall, so you can see it. Okay. All right, so this is happening in the Soviet Union, but there are some hardline communists, right? People who are like leaders of the Communist Party and people who have done well with the communism, right? And they don't want to get rid of communism. So even though it's clear, like, things are starting to go the other way, there's a resistance and there's a coup. A coup, remember, is when you try to overthrow the government by using force, right? Using the military. So you can see in the picture, they try to take over. They arrest Gorbachev. They tell the soldiers, you should, take control of the parliament building. And I remember watching the news and being shocked at, like, a coup happening in such a big country. And Boris Yeltsin is in the picture on the left. He is the man, they're standing on a tank. I don't know if you can tell that. And he's in the one on the left. And Boris Yeltsin was the newly elected president of the Russian Republic, right? Because they're trying not to be communists anymore. The push is to have elections and things. So he's a reformer, and of course, we like that, right? So President Bush telephoned him and said, well, we're supporting you. And he goes on television and tells all the people to stand up to the soldiers and come, encircle and protect the parliament and don't let this happen. And so it ends up that the coup does fall apart, and, Gorbachev is freed. And so democracy kind of takes over. And so what you see here then is the Soviet Union was actually a group of many different republics under their control, right? And so a lot of them start declaring independence from the Soviet Union. And Yeltsin, being the new leader, he bans the Communist Party. And so basically the Soviet Union is over. And there's a big speech by Gorbachev, saying that. And so this is the end of the Soviet Union. So, of course, the West and the United States and other democratic countries, think this is wonderful, right? Because we've been trying to fight communism for a really long time. Okay. All right. But that doesn't mean that all our troubles are over now that, like, the Cold War is ending. There are still a lot of other issues around the world that we end up getting involved in. Okay. So I'm going to go through a few of these different ones all over the world. So first, we're going to start in Panama. The dictator there, Manuel Noriega, he led a corrupt government. And in 1989, President Bush actually sent U.S. troops there to overthrow Noriega. So I'd love to hear what you think about that we get so involved that we, try to topple dictators in other areas. And they took him and they sent him to the United States on drug trafficking charges. Okay. And we helped, make sure that they had elections and organized a new government. Okay. So we got very involved in Panama. Like I said, let's talk about that. China is another concern that we have. Bush had actually been a diplomat in China earlier in his career. So he was very familiar with them and how their communist government really was very controlling, especially, even the economy. And so they're starting to make changes in this time period in history, and they're starting to have a little more freedom, and businesses are actually, allowed to get a little bit more freedom. And so we are encouraged by that. However, they did not make changes in their political system, right? So they might be okay with their economy kind of opening up, but they are not about their government. And so this wave of democracy is going around the world. And so in May of '89, there were many actually demonstrations, protests by students and workers, and they wanted democracy. And to make a long story short, they kept doing these protests, and the government told them to disperse, and they wouldn't. And when they wouldn't, the communist government doesn't take no for an answer. So they sent out the troops against the people. And it came to a head, unfortunately, in Tiananmen Square, which is that picture there on the top. And it's just like a big open space, right? And there were protests going on. And so they ended up, the troops, told them to leave. They wouldn't. And so they actually started firing on and killing many of the protesters. Some of them even weren't protesters, they were just watching. So we don't know the exact number that were killed. It's at least several hundred. Some people even think maybe it's up to like 1,000. We don't really know. The communist government is very controlling of the information. And of course, this, some video and things got out. This picture at the bottom is one of the most famous. There's a little video of it too, of, when they sent the tanks in, this man stood in front of it. And the tanks actually stopped, right? Because they didn't want to run him over. And they tried to go around him, and then he kind of ran in front of them. So it's an example of that's actually pretty darn brave, right? He could have been run over, but he wasn't. But they did, kill many other people. And, of course, the United States and other countries are protesting, killing innocent people just for, like, protesting. And so that's a sign that, communism is still going strong and the control there in China. And we'll talk about human rights a lot in China. Okay. All right. Then we're going to move over to the Gulf War. So at the top here, I've called it Operation Desert Storm, which is what I remember it being called mostly at the time. That's one particular part of the war overall. Usually they call it the Persian Gulf War. It's in the Middle East, of course. So it started in 1990 when Iraq's dictator Saddam Hussein sent his army into Kuwait. Now, really, he wanted their oil. He gave some lame excuse about, really Kuwait should be ours. It wasn't fair that, it was taken away from us by the UN and all these, excuses. But really people think it was because he wanted their oil. And, the Bush and other countries tried to tell him, you better get out of there because we're not going to stand for you invading, other neighboring countries, especially when, you control the oil, right? And he's a dictator that we don't approve of. And so basically, of course, he doesn't listen. And so the U.S. and other countries join what they call a coalition, right? They group together. And so they call them coalition forces were sent in. So some of our major generals, Colin Powell and Norman Schwarzkopf were our U.S. generals that were very involved in this. And of course, other countries were too. And you may know Colin Powell gets very rewarded with political posts afterwards. But anyway, that's here or there. So anyway, Operation Desert Storm was a huge missile attacks and bombings raids. And I remember, again, watching this on television. And it's so weird to be able to basically watch a war going on in another country live in your living room. Okay. And so we were watching it. And so about 6 weeks later, they actually sent ground troops in too. And that was the end. It only took a few days. And then the coalition forces were successful and they freed Kuwait. And Iraq had to give up, right? Because the coalition forces were clearly winning. And so we, said that was victory. And so unlike many of our other wars we've talked about, right, like with Vietnam, this one is quick and successful and people come back and like American troops are treated like heroes or, people are cheering. So it is very interesting the different responses the different wars get from people at home. There's a kind of a bigger story with him, Saddam Hussein. It goes on past this in some other instances, but we're not going to get too much into that right now. Okay. All right. Then I want to switch over and talk about conflicts in the Balkans. So you'll hear that word Balkans. Balkans means the Balkan Peninsula. So the top one I've done, I've shown you a picture of what the Balkan Peninsula is. The Balkans are what we used to be called Yugoslavia, okay? Yugoslavia was a communist country made up of several different republics. Today, they are about 6 independent countries now. But in the early 1990s, some of them started leaving the group, right? So Slovenia, Croatia, and Bosnia-Herzegovina, they all declared their independence. They didn't want to be part of Yugoslavia anymore. And then there's a long history of problems in this area because there's a lot of different ethnic groups and religions and long time, bad feelings. And so to make a long story short, there were groups called Serbs, okay, an ethnic group, and one of the republics, Serbia, helped and tried to encourage the Serbs in Croatia and Bosnia to fight. And so there was a lot of bad feelings. And basically, to make a long story short, there ends up being a civil war in the area and thousands of people die. And there's some, war atrocities and things. We're not going to get too much into details in here. I will show you a quick video that gives you some more detail. But basically what you need to know is, again, NATO, which the U.S. is part of, didn't like what was going on. And so they actually, again, had a coalition forces go in and get involved. And basically, to make a long story short, in 1995, they finally made peace accords, or they called them the Dayton Accords. And in the long run, there is no Yugoslavia anymore, and all of the 6 are independent countries now. Okay? But there was a lot of fighting and conflict at that time in the 90s. All right. And then not only is President Bush dealing with all those foreign issues, he's also dealing with a lot of problems at home. They call it domestic policy, right? Domestic means at home. So we have an economic recession happening in the 90s. A recession means the economy has stopped growing, which is bad, of course, right? There's a lot of reasons, right? The end of the Cold War means less military spending, and then that means less jobs for the people who work in the defense industry. Companies start to downsize or lay off workers so that they're more efficient. So there's a lot of people out of work. In the 80s, if you remember, there was a lot of government borrowing of money. And then so now our federal debt is really high. And also businesses and personal debt has also grown. And so that kind of problem, all that debt is making the recession worse. People keep borrowing and then they couldn't make their loan payments. And then when you can't make your loan payments, you have to sell what you own to be able to pay off those debts. And if you can't do that, keep up, then you go bankrupt. So there's a lot of problems with the economy. Some people were saying that the government needed to spend money to put money back into the economy. We've talked about that ploy before, right, in previous years. Bush, though, did not want to do that, right? He's a staunch Republican who's against federal spending, and so he did not want to do that, but he did extend benefits for the jobless to try to help them. But otherwise, he did not want to make, big government involvement, right? Because he's a staunch Republican. Okay, and so that also leads to a related issue, the banking crisis. So previously, the Congress and Reagan had cut regulations, right? Remember, Reagan was all about giving freedom to the companies and in this case banks too. And so they cut regulations on the Savings and Loans Association, which are a kind of bank, right? And unfortunately, they made risky loans since there wasn't a lot of rules around what they could do. And of course, if you give it a loan to someone who, probably can't pay it back, that's really bad. So when people can't pay it back, right, the savings and loans lose money and they go out of business. Well, here's the problem. The government insures savings accounts and savings and loans. So if they go bankrupt, the government has to help pay out so the people don't lose all their money. And so the government ended up having to pay billions of dollars to help out the people who had money in these savings and loans. And a lot of them gave what they call bailouts, help basically to those that aren't out of business yet, but look like they might be, so that you can try to prevent it. So in all, the government ended up spending $160 billion in this banking crisis, trying to, help prop up the banks so that it doesn't hurt the people. So even though he had a lot of problems, right? He had foreign issues to deal with. He had all this economy stuff. He did have some things that went well for him. His big achievements, people would say, would be one, he improved the Clean Air Act, which is great, right? Environmentally. He also did things to advance civil rights. For example, the Americans with Disabilities Act of 1990 did things like banning job discrimination against people with disabilities. They also helped make rules to help give access to workplaces, transportation, housing. So, for instance, there's rules now about you have to have a ramp into a business so that they could get there in a wheelchair, right? You're supposed to have, even at Pinewood, did you ever notice, like, on the stage, next to the stage, there's actually a wheelchair like little elevator. Have you ever noticed that? That's because we have stairs there and people can't go up if they're on a wheelchair. So we have a way to get them up there. I don't know if you ever noticed that. Also, he did a lot for the war on drugs, they called it. He made a new office of the National Drug Control Policy, which actually oversaw 50 different agencies, all about trying to help with the war on drugs. Okay, so we'll talk more later. And remember, he is Bush Sr., and then his son later is going to become, and they call him W, right? His middle initial, George W. Bush. So that's how you kind of tell them apart. It is confusing, though.